When Clara tore the hood from the Apache warrior she'd purchased for 2 pesos, her blood froze in recognition. The distinctive scarred shoulder belonged to the same man who had secretly left medicine that saved her dying children during the fever that took her husband. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory. 1867. The dust rose in thin spirals from beneath Clara Wilkinson's worn boots as she walked the final stretch of road leading into Santa Fe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the path, painting the world in shades of amber and gold that belied the coldness settling in her chest. Her shawl, once a vibrant blue, now faded to the color of forgotten skies, was pulled tight against the spring chill that seemed to seep through to her bones. Behind her lay the 20 miles she had traveled from her failing ranch, a journey made on foot after selling her last horse 3 weeks prior. Before her stood the territorial courthouse where the auction would soon begin. Clara clutched the small cloth pouch containing 2 silver pesos, rolling the coins between her fingers as if to multiply them through sheer determination. 2 pesos. All that remained of a life once flush with promise. The courthouse square was already filling with men in dusty coats and wide-brimmed hats. Their voices created a rumbling backdrop to Clara's thoughts as she slipped between shoulders, making herself smaller by instinct, a habit formed over the 10 months since Jacob's death. At 34, Clara was neither young bride nor resigned widow. She existed in that uncertain territory between what had been and what might yet be, her auburn hair streaked with the first strands of silver, her green eyes carrying both sorrow and steel. "They're bringing in the prisoners now," someone muttered as the crowd shifted. Clara pressed forward until she could see the wooden platform where Sheriff Holcomb stood with his ledger. Behind him, a line of men in chains shuffled into view, debtors, petty criminals and drifters sentenced to labor contracts that would be auctioned to the highest bidder. It was a practice Clara had always found disturbing, but today she stood among the bidders rather than the critics. Her children, Emma 9 and Thomas 7, needed to eat. Her land needed working. Principles, she had discovered, could be luxuries when starvation loomed. "Final prisoner," announced the sheriff, consulting his papers with a frown. "Apache, captured near Glorieta Pass. No name given." A murmur rippled through the crowd as the guards brought forward a figure taller than the others. Unlike the prisoners before him, this man's face was covered with a rough burlap hood, his copper-skinned hands bound before him with thick iron shackles. His shoulders were broad beneath the tattered shirt, his posture unbowed despite the chains. "Starting bid for a 12-month labor contract, $20, called the sheriff. The crowd fell silent. Men who had bid eagerly on other prisoners now stepped back slightly, creating a small circle of empty space around the platform. "Apache?" spat a voice from the crowd. "Might as well bid on your own funeral." Laughter, brittle and nervous, followed the comment. Clara watched the hooded figure, noticing how he stood completely still, as if separated from the mockery by more than just cloth and distance. $15, tried the sheriff, frowning at his audience. 10. More silence. The Apache's head turned slightly, as if scanning the crowd from beneath his hood. Clara felt her heart pounding against her ribs. The ranch was failing. The children were surviving on cornmeal and whatever game Thomas could snare in the foothills. She needed help, strong hands to repair fences, tend crops, rebuild what was crumbling. No one in town would work for her after rumors spread that the Wilkinson land was cursed. Some blamed Apache spirits. Others simply noted that no man had prospered there since the previous owner was found with Apache arrows in his back. "Any bid at all?" called the sheriff, impatience edging into his voice. Before she could reconsider, Clara stepped forward. 2 pesos, she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed square. Sheriff Holcomb squinted against the sun. "Mrs. Wilkinson?" "2 pesos, she repeated, holding up the small coins that caught the light. "It's all I have." A ripple of disbelief moved through the onlookers. Someone laughed, a sharp, unkind sound. "Widows gone mad with grief," muttered a man to Clara's right. "Taking an Apache onto her land. Might as well dig 3 graves now." Clara kept her eyes fixed on the sheriff, ignoring the whispers that surrounded her like circling crows. The Apache's head had turned toward her voice, and though she couldn't see his eyes, she felt the weight of his attention. Sheriff Holcomb cleared his throat. 2 pesos, then. Any other bids?" He paused, looking over the crowd with a mixture of concern and resignation. "Sold to Mrs. Clara Wilkinson." As the crowd parted before her, Clara walked forward to claim her purchase, the 2 pesos leaving a strange emptiness in her palm. She was now the owner of a 12-month labor contract for a man whose face she had not seen and whose language she did not speak. And somehow, those 2 coins felt heavier leaving her hand than they ever had within it. The sheriff's office smelled of tobacco, old leather, and the faint metallic scent of gun oil. Clara stood stiffly by the door, watching as Sheriff Holcomb filled out the contract papers with exaggerated care, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. The Apache prisoner remained standing in the corner, still hooded, flanked by 2 deputies who kept their hands near their holsters. "Mrs. Wilkinson," the sheriff said without looking up, "I feel obliged to express my concerns about this arrangement." "Your concerns are noted," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "But the contract is paid for." Holcomb removed his spectacles, folding them with deliberate slowness. 2 pesos wouldn't buy you a decent meal in this town, let alone a year's labor. I could void this sale, cite public safety. Is that what you'd do if Mr. Richardson had made the purchase, or Mr. Holloway? Clara's chin lifted slightly. The law doesn't specify a minimum price. The auction was fair. The sheriff studied her face, his weathered features settling into reluctant acceptance. "Your husband was a good man. He wouldn't want—" "My husband is dead," Clara interrupted, the words sharp enough to cut glass. "And my children are hungry. I've made my decision." After a long pause, Holcomb nodded to the deputies. "Take off his hood. Mrs. Wilkinson should at least see what she's bought." One of the men stepped forward, pistol drawn, while the other reached for the rough burlap covering the Apache's head. Clara watched, her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling. The hood came away in a single motion. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick as river mud. The Apache stood tall, his black hair falling past his shoulders, unbound and thick as a stallion's mane. His face was all angles, high cheekbones, straight nose, strong jaw, marked with 2 horizontal red lines painted across his cheeks. But it was his eyes that held Clara frozen in place, dark as midnight, yet burning with an intensity that seemed to see through her, past flesh and bone to whatever lay beneath. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 or so, with the hard, muscled build of a warrior rather than the wiry toughness of the other prisoners. And though his face remained impassive, there was a dignity in his bearing that chains could not diminish. "This here's Stone Wolf, from what the scouts tell us," Holcomb said, breaking the silence. "Raiding party leader. Took us 3 weeks to track him down after he attacked a supply wagon near the pass." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak as she continued to study the man before her. Something about him seemed familiar, though she was certain they had never met. How could they have? The Wilkinson Ranch lay 20 miles from town, and the Apache rarely came so close to settled lands except to— The realization struck her like a physical blow. Clara's gaze dropped to his right shoulder, where his tattered shirt had slipped down slightly. There, partially visible, was a distinctive crescent-shaped scar, its edges puckered and white against his copper skin. The medicine man. Last winter, when fever swept through the territory, it had taken Jacob within days. Emma and Thomas had fallen ill next, burning with the same sickness that had claimed their father. Clara, desperate and alone, had ridden to town for the doctor, only to find him overwhelmed with other cases. She had returned home with nothing but prayer to comfort her dying children. The next morning, she had discovered a small bundle of herbs outside the cabin door, strange plants tied with sinew, unlike any she had seen before. A note in broken English had accompanied them. Boil in water, give to drink, save children. She had been too desperate to question the gift. The children had recovered within days. Later, she had glimpsed a figure watching the ranch from the distant ridge, a lone Apache on horseback. She had seen only his silhouette, but remembered the way he had raised his hand in acknowledgement when she stepped outside. Then he was gone, vanishing like morning mist. Now, standing before her in chains, was that same man. She was certain of it. Clara's mouth went dry. Did he recognize her? Did he know whose land he was being sent to work? His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on hers, unblinking. Mrs. Wilkinson. Sheriff Holcomb's voice seemed to come from very far away. Do you still want to proceed? Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away from the Apache's burning gaze. Yes, she said quietly, the contract stands. Holcomb sighed, pushing the papers across the desk for her to sign. As she took the pen, Clara felt the weight of the Apache's stare on the back of her neck, raising goosebumps along her skin. God help you, the sheriff muttered as he handed her the key to the shackles. You'll need it. Clara took the key, cold iron against her palm, and faced the man who had saved her children, the enemy she had just purchased for 2 pesos. The journey back to the Wilkinson ranch stretched before Clara like an endless ribbon of dust and uncertainty. With no horse to carry them, they would walk the 20 miles beneath the merciless New Mexico sun, each step taking them farther from civilization and deeper into the questions that burned in her mind. She had released the Apache's leg irons, but kept his wrists shackled, the heavy chain between them jangling with each step. It wasn't trust that prompted this half measure, it was practicality. They would make better time if he could walk freely, but she wasn't foolish enough to remove all restraints. Not yet. They had passed beyond the town's borders when Clara finally spoke, her voice carried backward by the spring breeze. You have a name besides the one they gave you? For so long, there was no response that she thought he might not speak English after all. Then his voice came, deep and accented but clear. Nakohe. She tested the unfamiliar sounds. Nakohe. He made a small sound that might have been approval or amusement at her pronunciation. Clara glanced back at him, noticing how he walked with the natural grace of a man accustomed to covering great distances on foot. Despite the chains, despite the circumstances, there was something undefeated about him. You saved my children. It wasn't a question. Nakohe's pace remained steady, his face impassive. The fever does not choose sides. The simple statement hung in the air between them, settling over Clara like a revelation. How many times had Jacob told her that Apaches were animals, incapable of mercy or compassion? How many times had she half believed it, because believing made the world simpler, made the conflict that surrounded their lives easier to accept? Why did you help us? Nakohe's eyes fixed on the horizon. I watched your ranch for many moons. You worked hard. Your man died, children cried, you did not leave. His broken English couldn't disguise the respect in his voice, the recognition of her determination to hold on to the land after Jacob's death, when many widows would have fled back east to family. The land is all we have, Clara replied softly. Land belongs to no one. Clara nearly stumbled at this, turning to study his face. There was no challenge in his expression, only a statement of what he believed to be obvious truth, a belief that made her own claim to the ranch, to any part of this territory, suddenly seem absurd. They continued in silence for a time, The only sounds their footfalls on the hard-packed earth and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. The sun climbed higher, and Clara felt perspiration dampening her dress beneath her arms and between her shoulder blades. "There's water in that canteen," she said, gesturing to the container strapped across her shoulder. "You can drink if you're thirsty." Nakohe shook his head once, a gesture so slight she nearly missed it. "You think I poisoned it?" Clara asked, a surprising flicker of hurt in her voice. "No." His eyes met hers briefly. "But you will need it more." The simple comment, his recognition of her physical limitations compared to his own hardiness, made her cheeks warm with something between embarrassment and gratitude. He had observed her truthfully, without malice, seeing her as she was. It had been a long time since anyone had truly seen Clara Wilkinson. Near midday, they encountered a wagon heading towards Santa Fe. The driver, a bearded man Clara recognized as one of the merchants who occasionally passed through the area, slowed his team at the sight of them. His eyes widened at the unusual pair, a widow and her Apache captive walking the lonely road. "Mrs. Wilkinson?" he called, his hand drifting to the rifle prop beside him. "Everything all right here?" Clara felt Nakohe tense beside her, his shoulders straightening almost imperceptibly. "Perfectly fine, Mr. Reeves," she replied with forced lightness. "We're just heading home." Reeves' gaze shifted between them, suspicion etched into every line of his weathered face. "Heard talk in town about the auction. Didn't believe it myself." "People will talk," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We should continue on. The children are waiting." "I could give you a ride," Reeves offered, though his expression suggested he'd rather not. "Not him, though. He'd have to walk behind." Clara hesitated, the temptation of easing her aching feet warring with her instinct that separating from Nakohe would be a mistake. Before she could answer, the Apache spoke. "We walk." His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "Both walk." Reeves's hand tightened on his rifle. "Seems like your property's giving orders now, Mrs. Wilkinson." "Thank you for your concern," Clara said firmly, "but we'll manage on our own." The merchant shook his head in disgust. "Your husband would be turning in his grave, ma'am. Jacob Wilkinson fought Apaches. Now you're bringing one home like a stray dog." Clara felt Nakohe go still beside her, sensed rather than saw the subtle shift in his stance. When she glanced at him, his eyes were focused on some distant point, as if Reeves weren't worth acknowledging. "Good day, Mr. Reeves," Clara said coldly, stepping past the wagon. The merchant spat in the dust near Nakohe's feet. "Your funeral," he muttered, flicking the reins to continue his journey. As they walked on, Clara's mind churned with questions she couldn't articulate. What was she doing? What madness had possessed her to bring an Apache warrior, a man her husband had considered an enemy, to the home where her children slept? And yet, this was the same man who had saved those children when no one else would help. "Your husband fought my people?" Nakohe asked after a long silence. Clara nodded. "In the cavalry, before we married." "And you?" His dark eyes found hers, searching. "You fight Apaches too?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications Clara wasn't prepared to face. Instead of answering, she unstopped the canteen and drank deeply before offering it to him. This time, Nakohe accepted. The sun was sinking toward the western hills when the Wilkinson Ranch finally came into view. From a distance, it might have looked peaceful, a small cabin nestled against the foothills, a weathered barn leaning slightly to one side, fields stretching out before them like a faded quilt. But as they drew closer, the signs of neglect became impossible to ignore. Broken fence posts, untilled earth, shutters hanging askew from rusted hinges. Clara felt a familiar ache in her chest at the sight. Once, this land had held such promise. Now it stood as a monument to all she had lost, and all she still might lose if she couldn't somehow reverse its decline. Nakohe studied the ranch with unreadable eyes, taking in every detail. What did he see? Clara wondered. Enemy territory? Opportunity? Or simply another patch of earth that, as he believed, belonged to no one? A small figure darted from the cabin door, followed closely by another. Emma and Thomas, spotting their mother on the road, ran toward her with the abandoned joy of children who had been waiting too long. "Mama!" Emma called, her auburn braids bouncing with each step. Then she saw Nakohe and skidded to a halt, grabbing her younger brother's arm to stop him as well. Clara quickened her pace, positioning herself slightly ahead of the Apache. "It's all right," she called to her children, though she wasn't entirely certain of that herself. Emma's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fascination as she stared at Nakohe. Thomas, still only 7, stepped partially behind his sister, one hand clutching her dress, the other reaching reflexively for the small knife he'd taken to carrying since his father's death. "Children," Clara said as she reached them, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "This is Nakohe. He'll be helping us with the ranch." Emma's gaze flicked to the chains on Nakohe's wrists, then back to her mother's face. She was old enough to understand what this meant, that her mother had purchased a contract laborer, and an Apache at that. Old enough to have heard her father's stories about savage raids and painted warriors who took scalps as trophies. "Like Mr. Peterson?" Thomas asked, referring to the farmhand who had briefly worked their land the previous summer before moving on to more promising employment. "Not exactly," Clara replied. "Nakohe will stay longer. He knows the land and has special skills that will help us." Thomas peered around his sister, his curiosity beginning to overcome his fear. "Are you really an Apache?" Nakohe inclined his head slightly, but did not speak. "Thomas," Clara said with gentle warning, "go inside and set 2 more places for supper. Emma, bring water for washing up." The children hesitated, exchanging a look that Clara recognized all too well. The silent communication of siblings deciding whether to obey or question. Finally, with one last glance at Nakohe, they turned and ran back to the cabin. "They are afraid," Nakohe said quietly as they walked the remaining distance. "They've been taught to fear Apache warriors," Clara admitted. "As I was." And now? Clara considered this as they approached the cabin's sagging porch. "Now I wonder what else I was wrongly taught." Inside, the cabin was small but clean, with the desperate orderliness of a place whose inhabitants were fighting against collapse. A fire burned low in the hearth, a pot of something thin and fragrant, rabbit stew from the smell of it, simmering above the flames. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a rough-hewn table, 4 mismatched chairs, and a faded settee that had been carried all the way from St. Louis when the Wilkinsons first arrived. A narrow hallway led to 2 small bedrooms, one for Clara, one for the children. Emma was filling a basin with water from the pump kettle, her movements precise and adult-like, while Thomas clumsily arranged wooden plates on the table, stealing glances at Nakohe every few seconds. Clara set down her few belongings from town and turned to face the Apache. For a moment she simply stood there, uncertain of how to proceed. Then, with a deep breath, she removed the small key from her pocket, the one Sheriff Holcomb had given her for the shackles. "If I remove these," she said quietly, "I need your word that you won't try to escape or harm us." Nakohe's dark eyes held hers. "You have my word. Why should I believe you?" A faint shadow that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Why should I give medicine to enemy children?" The simple logic of this struck Clara into silence. He was right. If he had wanted to harm her family, he had already passed up the opportunity to let fever do it for him. She inserted the key into the lock and turned it, the metallic click seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. The shackles fell away, revealing raw, reddened skin beneath. Nakohe rubbed his wrists slowly, his expression betraying nothing of the pain he must have felt. Emma gasped softly. "Mama, his wrists are hurt." Clara hesitated only a moment before turning to her daughter. "Bring the salve from the medicine shelf and clean bandages." Emma darted to comply, retrieving a small clay pot of homemade balm, a mixture of beeswax, herbs, and rendered fat that Clara used for everything from burns to saddle sores. She handed it to her mother with solemn ceremony, then stood watching as Clara gestured for Nakohe to sit at the table. "This will help," Clara said, scooping a small amount of the salve onto her fingers. She reached for his right wrist, then paused, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the gesture. Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them. Permission, perhaps, or acknowledgement of a boundary being crossed. Gently, she applied the salve to his abraded skin, feeling the heat of him beneath her fingertips, the strength in tendons and bones that could so easily break her in two. Yet his hands remained perfectly still under her ministrations, accepting the care without comment. "Where will he sleep, Mama?" Thomas asked, breaking the strange tension that had filled the room. Clara withdrew her hands from Nakohe's wrists, wiping them on her apron. "In the barn for now, until we can arrange something better." "Pa's old cot is still out there," Emma offered, her initial fear seeming to recede a little. "And there are extra blankets in the trunk." Nakohe's gaze moved from the girl to Clara. "I need little." "You'll need rest if you're to help with the spring planting tomorrow," Clara replied, more briskly than she intended. "We've lost too much time already." She ladled stew into wooden bowls, the thin broth barely concealing the few morsels of meat and vegetables. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. As they sat around the table, Clara and the children on three sides, Nakohe on the fourth, an awkward silence descended. Thomas stared openly at their guest. "Do you scalp people?" he blurted out. "Thomas!" Clara admonished, horrified, but Nakohe merely regarded the boy steadily. "Do you?" Thomas blinked in surprise, then giggled nervously. "No! Then we are the same," Nakohe said simply, and began to eat his stew with deliberate dignity that made the meager meal seem somehow more substantial than it was. Dawn arrived with pale fingers of light stretching across the land, illuminating the dew that clung to the sparse grass surrounding the Wilkinson ranch. Clara had been awake for an hour already, stoking the fire, preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, and mentally cataloguing the overwhelming tasks that lay before them. The spring planting couldn't wait any longer, not if they hoped to harvest enough to survive another winter. When she stepped outside to fill the water bucket from the well, she found Nakohe already there. He stood motionless, watching the sunrise with an expression that suggested he was seeing something more than just the beginning of another day. Something sacred, perhaps. "You're awake early," Clara said, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance and hair hastily pinned beneath a faded kerchief. Nakohe turned to her, his face composed once more. "The land speaks clearest at dawn." "What does it say?" The question escaped before she could reconsider its foolishness. To her surprise, he didn't dismiss it. "It says water comes soon." His eyes lifted to the distant mountains, then swept across the yellowed fields. "Rain. 3 days, maybe 4. Clara followed his gaze, seeing only clear skies and the familiar landscape. "There's not a cloud to be seen. The birds fly differently. The air smells of change." He gestured toward a patch of earth near the well. "And this plant, it opens before rain." Clara looked closer, noticing for the first time a small yellow flower she'd never paid attention to before. Its petals unfurled wide despite the early hour. My people planted this one, Nakohe continued. Many generations passed to know when water comes. The simple statement shifted something in Clara's understanding. This wasn't just land her husband had claimed and fenced. It had been known, used, and carefully tended long before any white settler laid eyes upon it. What needs first attention? Nakohe asked, bringing her back to the present moment. Clara shook off her thoughts. The south field. It needs to be cleared and plowed for corn, but without a horse. He nodded once, accepting the challenge without complaint. After a simple breakfast, during which the children stared at him with slightly less fear than the night before, they walked together to the field in question. It was modest in size, about 2 acres, but choked with weeds and debris blown in during the winter months. Under normal circumstances, Jacob would have hitched their horse to the plow and turned the soil in neat furrows while Clara followed behind with seed. But the horse was gone, sold to pay debts, and Jacob lay beneath a simple wooden cross on the hill behind the cabin. Nakohe surveyed the field, then disappeared into the barn without explanation. Clara was about to follow when he emerged carrying an odd implement, a long, curved piece of wood with a stone blade lashed to it with rawhide. "What is that?" she asked, confused. "Digging tool, Apache make." He demonstrated its use, driving the stone edge into the soil and turning it with a swift, practiced motion. Not fast like horse plow, but it works. "Where did you—" Clara began, then realized. "You made this? Last night?" He nodded, continuing his work with efficient movements. "Wood is good here, strong." Clara watched him for a moment, marveling at the ingenuity and the implication that he had spent hours of darkness crafting a tool rather than attempting escape. After a moment's hesitation, she retrieved her own hoe from the barn and began working alongside him, clearing weeds from the area he had already turned. They worked in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher. Emma brought water at midday, lingering to watch Nakohe with undisguised curiosity. When he paused to drink, she gathered her courage to speak. "How did you learn to make things like that?" Nakohe regarded her thoughtfully before answering. "My father taught me. His father taught him. Many generations. What else can you make?" The girl's natural curiosity was beginning to overcome her apprehension. A brief softening touched his features, not quite a smile, but something close. "Many things. Tools for planting, for hunting. Baskets to carry water that does not spill. Medicines from plants you walk past every day." Emma's eyes widened. "Like the medicine you brought us during the fever." Clara nearly dropped her hoe. She hadn't told the children about Nakohe's connection to their recovery, unsure how to explain it even to herself. Nakohe's gaze shifted to Clara, then back to Emma. "Yes, like that." "How did you know we were sick?" Emma persisted, oblivious to her mother's discomfort. "I watched. From the hills." He gestured toward the northern ridge. "I saw your father was gone. Then your mother, she rode fast to town and returned with nothing. I knew what this meant." Clara felt her throat tighten at the memory. Her desperate ride to Santa Fe, begging the overwhelmed doctor to come, being told to prepare for the worst, returning home with empty hands and a heart full of despair. "But why help us?" she asked, the question that had haunted her since recognizing him in the sheriff's office. "We were nothing to you." Nakohe was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on some middle distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, touched with an emotion Clara couldn't quite identify. 3 summers passed. Soldiers came to our camp while men hunted. They killed many, old ones, women, children, my wife, my son." His hand unconsciously moved to touch the crescent-shaped scar on his shoulder. "I was too far to help. When I returned, all was fire." The stark confession hung in the air between them. Clara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach at the thought of soldiers, men like Jacob, attacking a camp of defenseless women and children. She had heard rumors of such things, but had chosen not to believe them, just as she had chosen not to question where the cavalry-issue silver cufflinks Jacob brought home as souvenirs had really come from. After, I followed soldiers, Nakohe continued, watched their camps, learned their language, listened to their stories. Some laughed about what they had done, others did not. I saw that not all white eyes think the same. And us? Clara asked softly. Why did you help us specifically? Your husband was gone. You worked the land alone, fed your children without complaint, strong like a Apache woman. His eyes met hers directly. And your children, they have same age as my son would have now. The simple truth of it struck Clara with the force of revelation. This man, whom she had been taught to fear as less than human, had looked at her struggling family and seen a reflection of his own loss. Had offered mercy where he had received none. Emma, too young to fully grasp the weight of what she was hearing but old enough to sense its importance, reached out hesitantly and touched Nakohe's hand where it rested on the digging tool. Thank you, she said solemnly, for saving us. Before Nakohe could respond, the sound of approaching hooves broke the moment. A rider appeared on the road leading to the ranch, moving at an unhurried pace. Clara recognized the horse before she could make out the rider, a dappled grey mare belonging to Frederick Ellison, whose ranch bordered the Wilkinson property to the east. He had made no secret of his desire to absorb their struggling acreage into his own successful operation, approaching Clara with increasingly lower offers in the months since Jacob's death. Get back to the house, Emma, Clara said, her voice tense, and tell Thomas to stay inside. As Emma hurried away, Clara turned to Nakohe. That's Frederick Ellison. He owns the next ranch over. He's not likely to be friendly to you. Nakohe straightened to his full height, his expression closing like a door. I know this man. He leads the others who hunt Apaches for bounty. Clara felt a chill at his words. Jacob had spoken of bounty hunters, civilians who tracked and killed Apaches for the price on their scalps, with a mixture of disdain and reluctant admiration. She had never connected Ellison to such activities. It would be better if you weren't seen, she said quickly. Go to the barn, please. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, might choose to stand his ground despite the danger. Then, with a slight nod that somehow conveyed neither submission nor retreat, Nakohe turned and walked unhurriedly toward the barn, his dignity intact. Frederick Ellison dismounted with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. At 45, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache waxed to sharp points and eyes the pale blue of winter ice. His clothes were of good quality, his boots polished despite the dusty ride, and the silver concho belt at his waist gleamed in the midday sun. Mrs. Wilkinson, he called, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. I heard the most peculiar rumor in town. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, conscious of her disheveled appearance and the dirt under her fingernails. Mr. Ellison, what brings you to my property? He smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. Neighborly concern, my dear. Word has it you purchased an Apache at the territorial auction. Surely that can't be true. The false solicitude in his voice set Clara's teeth on edge. She was acutely aware of Nakohe in the barn, potentially within earshot of this conversation. My business arrangements are my own concern, Mr. Ellison. Ellison clucked his tongue, shaking his head as if saddened by her response. Clara, if I may, a woman alone with 2 young children, it's not safe. These savages can't be trusted. One minute they're docile as lambs, the next they'll slit your throat while you sleep. Thank you for your concern, Clara said stiffly, but we're managing just fine. Ellison's gaze swept over the property, the half-plowed field, the leaning fence, the weathered cabin in desperate need of repair. Are you? he asked quietly. Because my offer still stands. $500 for the whole spread. Enough to take your children back east, start fresh somewhere civilized. The answer is still no. A hardness crept into Ellison's expression. I could report you, you know, for harboring a dangerous enemy of the territory. The military would be very interested to hear about an Apache warrior living among white settlers. Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. He's a contracted laborer, legally obtained. There's nothing to report? Oh, I think there is. Ellison stepped closer, lowering his voice. I've hunted his kind for years. I know their markings, their tribal affiliations. If your Apache is who I think he is, there's a $100 bounty on his head, dead or alive. Before Clara could respond, a sharp cry came from behind the cabin. Thomas's voice, high with alarm. Mama, there's a snake! Clara's heart lurched. She turned toward the sound, then back to Ellison, torn between the immediate danger to her son and the threat standing before her. Go, Ellison said with a dismissive gesture. I can wait. Clara hurried around the cabin to find Thomas backed against the wall, a stick clutched in his trembling hands. A few feet away, coiled in warning, was a rattlesnake, its distinctive tail vibrating an ominous rhythm. Don't move, Thomas, she called, frantically searching for a weapon, but before she could act, a blur of movement caught her eye. Nakohe appeared from nowhere, swift and silent as a shadow. In one fluid motion, he grasped the snake just behind its head, his movements so quick that the creature had no time to strike. With a practiced twist of his wrist, he broke its spine. Thomas stared, wide-eyed, with a mixture of terror and awe. You are safe now, Nakohe said, his voice gentle despite the deadly efficiency of his actions. He held up the now limp snake. This one is good for eating, and the skin makes medicine. What the hell is this? Clara turned to find Ellison standing behind her, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. His gaze was fixed on Nakohe, recognition and hatred flaring in his pale eyes. Stone Wolf, he breathed. By God, it really is you. Nakohe stood slowly, the dead snake still in his grip, his face impassive. Only his eyes betrayed emotion, a cold wariness as he regarded the white man. You know each other? Clara asked, moving to stand beside Thomas, one arm protectively around her son's shoulders. Oh, we've never formally met, Ellison said with a humorless smile. But I've been tracking this particular devil for 2 years now. He and his raiders killed 3 of my men at Glorieta Pass. They attacked first, Nakohe said, his voice level. Hunting women, gathering plants. 2 died. Ellison's hand tightened on his pistol. Lies. That's all your kind knows. Mr. Ellison, Clara interjected, stepping forward. Nakohe just saved my son's life. Whatever happened in the past, Nakohe. Ellison's laugh was sharp and ugly. You're on a first-name basis with him now? Has he told you about the white settlers he's scalped? The women he's... Enough! Clara's voice cracked like a whip. This is my property. You will not threaten my worker or frighten my child with your accusations. Ellison's face darkened with fury. Your husband would be ashamed to see this, Clara, an Apache in his home and his widow defending the animal. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with deliberate calm, Nakohe knelt and offered the snake to Thomas. Take this to your sister. Show her how to prepare it, like I showed you with the rabbit. Thomas hesitated, looking to his mother for permission. At Clara's slight nod, he took the snake with surprising steadiness and disappeared around the corner of the cabin. Nakohe rose again, facing Ellison without fear or aggression, simply meeting his gaze as an equal. You have 1 week, Ellison said to Clara, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. 1 week to get rid of him and reconsider my offer. After that, I'll return with the sheriff and a proper posse. He turned to Nakohe, his lips curling in contempt. And you, enjoy your last days of breath. With that, He strode back to his horse, mounted in a single fluid motion, and rode off in a cloud of dust. In the silence that followed, Clara became acutely aware of how close she stood to Nakohe, of the heat radiating from his body in the cool spring air. She turned to face him, finding his dark eyes already on her. "I'm sorry," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. Ellison's threats, the history of violence between their peoples, or the unspoken truth that she had inadvertently placed Nakohe in greater danger by bringing him here. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he replied, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. Then, with a slight tilt of his head toward the field they had been working, he added, "The corn will not plant itself." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table, a single candle casting long shadows across the worn wood surface. Sleep eluded her, chased away by Ellison's threats and the impossible choice they presented. The $500 he offered would indeed be enough to take Emma and Thomas back east to the sister she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. They could start again in Pennsylvania, far from drought and hardship and the constant struggle to wrest life from unyielding earth. But the ranch was all she had left of Jacob. All the children had left of their father, and now, improbably, it had also become sanctuary to a man who, by all rights, should have been her enemy. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Nakohe standing on the porch, his powerful silhouette outlined by starlight. "You should be resting," Clara said, suddenly conscious of her loosened hair falling around her shoulders. She hadn't bothered to braid it for sleep, expecting to be alone with her thoughts until dawn. "As should you." His gaze took in the candle, the open Bible on the table that she hadn't actually been reading. "Yet you sit in darkness, thinking of Ellison's words." Clara hesitated, then stepped aside to let him enter. It wasn't proper, a man in her home at night with the children asleep, but propriety seemed a hollow concern against the larger troubles they faced. "He'll return with men," she said, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Emma and Thomas, "and when he does, they'll take you back to town. Or worse." Nakohe settled himself on the bench across from her chair, his movements deliberate and contained, as though he feared taking up too much space in her world. "I can leave before then, draw them away from here." "And go where?" "They'd hunt you down." Clara's fingers twisted the worn fabric of her nightdress. "Besides, your contract, chains on paper mean nothing to me," he interrupted gently. "I stay because I choose to." The simple statement hung between them, heavy with implications Clara wasn't ready to examine. Instead, she changed direction. "Ellison called you Stonewolf. He said you killed his men." Nakohe was silent for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like twin flames. "In war, I have killed, as your husband killed my people." There was no accusation in his voice, only a weary acknowledgement of the blood-soaked history they shared. "But I do not take scalps. I do not harm women or children. These are not our ways, though your people believe so." "My people," Clara repeated softly. "Sometimes I don't know who my people are anymore." A shadow of understanding crossed Nakohe's face. He reached across the table, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Clara placed her hand in his. His skin was warm and calloused, bearing the marks of a life lived close to the earth. "Your people are those who share your heart," he said. "Not your blood, not your skin." Clara felt something shift within her chest, a wall crumbling perhaps, or a door opening to a place she'd kept sealed since Jacob's death, or perhaps even longer. "The rain you predicted is coming," she said, glancing toward the window where the first hint of clouds had appeared on the horizon that evening. "How did you know?" The corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "My grandfather was a medicine man. He taught me to read the signs, in plants, in animals, in the wind. The land speaks, if you know how to listen. "Teach me," Clara said impulsively. "Teach me to hear it." Something kindled in Nakohe's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a deeper emotion she couldn't name. Before he could respond, a small voice spoke from the hallway. "Mama, I had a bad dream." Thomas stood in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes with one fist, his nightshirt rumpled around his thin frame. When he saw Nakohe, however, the fear that might have been expected didn't materialize. Instead, he padded across the room and climbed without hesitation onto the bench beside the Apache. "Did you have a bad dream too?" he asked, yawning. Nakohe regarded the boy with gentle gravity. "Sometimes, all warriors do." "What do you do when you're scared?" "I remember that fear is like a shadow. It seems big, but it cannot touch you unless you let it." Thomas considered this wisdom with the seriousness of a child trying to understand an adult concept. "Can you tell me a story? Pa used to tell stories when I had bad dreams." Clara started to intervene. It was late, and she'd already breached enough proprieties for one night. But Nakohe spoke first. "One story," he agreed, "about Coyote, who stole fire from the stars to warm the people during the longest winter." As Nakohe's deep voice filled the small cabin with ancient words, Clara watched her son's eyes grow heavy once more, his small body gradually relaxing against the warrior's side. The scene before her, this unlikely protector cradling her half-sleeping child, blurred as tears filled her eyes. For the first time since Jacob's death, she felt the fragile stirring of hope. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of shared labor and growing trust. True to Nakohe's prediction, rain came, gentle and persistent, softening the earth for planting. Under his guidance, they prepared the soil using methods Clara had never seen before, creating small mounds for corn, beans, and squash planted together in ancient harmony. "The corn grows tall to support the beans," he explained to Emma, who followed him like a shadow, absorbing his knowledge with eager attention. "The beans give strength to the soil. The squash leaves cover the ground, keeping moisture in and weeds out, 3 sisters working together." "Like a family," Emma observed. Nakohe nodded, something softening in his usually stoic expression. "Yes, like family." Clara, watching from where she worked nearby, felt her heart constrict at the simple exchange. In less than a week, this man had become more than a laborer, more than a reluctant guest. He had become essential to the ranch, to the children, to her. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it settled into her consciousness with the rightness of a key finding its lock. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat together on the porch watching lightning play across distant mountains, a rider appeared on the road. Not Ellison this time, but 17-year-old Billy Rawlins, whose family ran the general store in Santa Fe. "Mrs. Wilkinson," he called, reining in his panting horse. "Pa sent me to warn you. Ellison's been talking all over town, gathering men. They're coming tomorrow at first light." His eyes darted nervously to Nakohe, who had risen to stand beside Clara. "They aim to take the Apache, and they ain't planning to bring him back alive." The night pressed close around the cabin, darkness broken only by the faint glow of oil lamps as Clara and Nakohe prepared for what morning would bring. Billy Rawlins had ridden off with Clara's hurried thanks and a fresh canteen of water, his young face troubled as he glanced back at the unlikely pair standing shoulder to shoulder on the porch. Inside, Emma and Thomas slept, unaware of the danger approaching with the dawn. "You should take the children and go," Nakohe said, his voice low as he checked the priming on Jacob's old shotgun, the only firearm on the property. "To a neighbor, perhaps, the widow Hanson to the south, and leave you to face Ellison alone." Clara shook her head firmly. "No, this is not your fight. It became my fight the moment I paid 2 pesos for your contract. Clara's hands were steady as she wrapped leftover cornbread and strips of dried meat in cloth, tucking them into a small sack. Besides, Mrs. Hanson is 73 years old and nearly blind. She can barely protect herself, let alone my children. Nakohe's dark eyes studied her face. Then we must move the children somewhere safe. Clara paused, considering their limited options. The closest town was Santa Fe, a day's journey by foot. The neighboring ranches all belonged to men who would likely side with Ellison. There was nowhere to... The cave, she said suddenly, remembering a place she hadn't thought about in years. In the hills north of here, Jacob used to take Thomas there sometimes, hunting rabbits. It's well hidden, dry even in the rain. Nakohe nodded. I know this place. A good shelter. He didn't mention how he knew of it, but Clara suspected it had been during his time observing the ranch from afar, before Jacob's death. We'll take the children there at first light, she decided. With food and water, Emma can watch over Thomas until... Until what? Until Ellison and his men had gone. Until they'd taken Nakohe away, or killed him. The unfinished thought hung between them, heavy with implication. And then, Nakohe asked, giving voice to the question she couldn't complete. Clara looked down at her hands, roughened by work, strengthened by hardship, capable of more than she'd ever imagined. Then I'll come back and face Ellison. No? His response was immediate, brooking no argument. Too dangerous. This is my home, Clara said, lifting her chin with sudden defiance. I won't be driven from it by threats and hatred. Not again. Something flickered in Nakohe's eyes, surprise perhaps or recognition. Again? Clara hadn't meant to say so much, to reveal a part of herself she kept buried beneath years and miles. But now, facing the possibility that tomorrow might change everything, the words came unbidden. Before we came west, we lived in Missouri. Jacob was a blacksmith then. There was another man, wealthy from a prominent family. He wanted our land for some business venture. When Jacob refused to sell, there were incidents, a fire in our stable, threats against the children. Her voice grew tight at the memory. In the end, we sold for less than half its value and fled west. Jacob joined the cavalry to support us, and then she trailed off, the rest of the story too familiar to need telling. And now you face the same choice, Nakohe said softly. Except this time, I'm not running. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. I've lost too much already. I won't lose what little I have left. Their eyes met across the table, and something silent passed between them. An understanding deeper than words, a recognition of shared resolve in the face of forces that would destroy them both. Then we face them together, Nakohe said finally. They'll kill you, perhaps. His hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the table. Or perhaps not. I have lived with death as my shadow since the day I found my family in ashes. Each breath since then has been a gift I did not expect. Clara turned her palm upward, her fingers intertwining with his, a gesture she had not planned, had not even known she wanted until it happened. His skin was warm against hers, the calluses of his warrior's hands matching the hardened patches on her own. There must be another way, she whispered. A faint smile touched Nakohe's lips. My people have a saying. When standing between the mountain and the river, sometimes the only path is through. Before Clara could respond, a small sound from the doorway drew their attention. Emma stood there in her nightdress, her eyes wide as she took in the scene before her. The packed food, the shotgun, her mother's hand clasped with Nakohe's. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Clara pulled away from Nakohe, a flush warming her cheeks. "Emma, you should be sleeping." I heard talking. The girl stepped further into the room, her gaze moving between the adults with the perceptiveness of a child who had grown up too quickly. Something's wrong, I can tell. After a moment's hesitation, Clara beckoned her daughter closer. Come here, sweetheart. Emma approached, and Clara pulled her into an embrace, breathing in the scent of her hair, soap and sunshine and innocence she was desperate to preserve. Some men are coming tomorrow, Clara explained, choosing her words carefully. Men who don't understand about Nakohe. They might try to take him away or hurt him. So we're going to hide you and Thomas somewhere safe until they're gone. Emma stiffened in her arms. But what about you and Nakohe? We'll be fine, Clara assured her, though the promise felt hollow even as she spoke it. Emma pulled back, her young face set with determination that reminded Clara painfully of Jacob. I want to help. The best way to help is to keep your brother safe, Nakohe said gently. Can you do this? It is a warrior's task. The girl's chest swelled with pride at being entrusted with such responsibility. Yes, I can do it. Good. He reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew a smooth stone, polished and marked with a symbol Clara didn't recognize. Take this. It will protect you. Emma accepted the stone with solemn reverence. What does the mark mean? Harmony, Nakohe replied. Balance between all things. My father gave it to me when I was not much older than you. Clara felt her throat tighten at the gift, not just the stone itself, but the piece of his past, his family, that he was entrusting to her daughter. Now back to bed, she said, kissing Emma's forehead. We'll wake you before dawn. After Emma had returned to her room, Clara and Nakohe continued their preparations in a silence that was both companionable and charged with unspoken emotion. They moved around each other with the ease of partners who had worked side by side far longer than a mere week, anticipating needs, communicating with glances and gestures as much as words. As the night deepened toward its darkest hour, they found themselves on the porch, watching as clouds scudded across the star-strewn sky. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of rain-washed earth and sage. In another life, Clara said softly, this might have been peaceful. Nakohe's shoulder brushed against hers as he leaned against the porch railing. In this life, it is peaceful. For this moment. Just this moment, she agreed, acutely aware of his proximity, of the heat of him beside her in the chill night air. My people believe that all moments exist together, past, present, future. Like beads on a necklace, we move from one to the next, but they are all there, always. Clara considered this. So somewhere, all moments of peace still exist, even ones we've lost. Yes, his voice was a rumble beside her. And somewhere all moments of peace that will come also exist, waiting. I'd like to believe that. She turned to face him, finding his eyes already on her face, watchful and warm. That there will be peace again, after tomorrow. There will be. His hand rose, hesitantly, to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, a touch so light she might have imagined it, except for the trail of warmth it left on her skin. For you, for the children, for us, Clara corrected gently. Something shifted in his expression then, a softening around the eyes, a vulnerability that made him suddenly seem younger, less burdened by the weight of all he had endured. Clara, he began, her name in his mouth a sound unlike any she'd heard before. But whatever he intended to say remained unspoken, for at that moment the distant sound of horses broke the night's stillness. Many horses moving fast. Clara's heart lurched. Ellison, but it's too early. Billy said dawn. They come by night to catch us unprepared. Nakohe was already moving, his body taut with alertness. Wake the children, now! Clara's hands trembled as she shook Thomas awake, her voice urgent but controlled. Get up quickly, no questions now. The boy blinked in confusion but obeyed. Years of frontier life having taught him that immediate compliance sometimes meant the difference between safety and danger. Emma was already pulling on her boots, face pale but composed, as she stuffed an extra blanket into a small pack. Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Clara estimated they had minutes, perhaps less. Nakohe appeared in the doorway, Jacob's shotgun in one hand, a small bundle in the other. "No time for the cave. They are too close." His eyes, sharp even in the dim light, assessed the room in a single glance. "The root cellar." Clara nodded. The small storage space beneath the kitchen floor, dug to preserve vegetables through winter, was cramped and musty, but it would hide the children, if Ellison didn't think to look there. "This way," she whispered, lifting the trapdoor concealed beneath a rag rug. The earthy smell of stored potatoes and onions wafted upward as Emma climbed down first, Thomas following with wide, frightened eyes. "Mama?" Thomas's voice quavered as he looked up from the darkness. "Are you coming too?" "Soon," Clara promised, the lie bitter on her tongue. "Emma is in charge until then. Stay absolutely quiet, no matter what you hear, understand?" The children nodded solemnly. Clara handed down the food bundle Nakohe had prepared, then the water flask, her movements quick but gentle. "I love you both," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "More than anything." Before emotion could overwhelm her, she closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug, erasing all signs of the hiding place. When she straightened, she found Nakohe watching her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "They will be safe," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, a promise he intended to keep at any cost. Clara nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. Instead, she crossed to the fireplace and removed the iron poker from its stand. Not much of a weapon, but better than facing Ellison's men empty-handed. Outside, the horses had stopped. Male voices carried through the night air, tense, excited, fueled by whiskey and hatred. Clara counted at least 5 distinct speakers. Perhaps more remained silent. "Mrs. Wilkinson!" Ellison's voice boomed from the yard, falsely jovial. "I know you're in there. We've come for that Apache as I promised. Send him out and we'll be on our way. No harm to you or the little ones." Clara moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. In the yard, illuminated by moonlight and the lanterns several men carried, stood Ellison and 7 others. Local ranchers, a couple of drifters she'd seen lounging outside the saloon in Santa Fe, and to her shock, Sheriff Holcomb himself, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "It appears your week of grace has been shortened," Nakohe observed quietly, coming to stand beside her. "The lawman's presence changes things." Clara's mind raced. The sheriff's involvement meant this wasn't just a vigilante action, it had the veneer of official sanction. Any resistance would be considered criminal. "Mrs. Wilkinson," Ellison called again, impatience edging into his voice. "Don't make this difficult. We know he's in there." Clara exchanged a glance with Nakohe. In that brief look, a world of unspoken understanding passed between them. Then, squaring her shoulders, she moved to the door and opened it, stepping onto the porch with the iron poker held loosely at her side. "Mr. Ellison," she acknowledged coolly. "Sheriff, it's customary to wait until daylight for social calls." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the group of men. Sheriff Holcomb removed his hat, a gesture of perfunctory respect. "Mrs. Wilkinson, we've received reports that the Apache known as Stone Wolf has been seen on your property. He's wanted for questioning in relation to several attacks on settlers." "Questioning?" Ellison scoffed. "There's a bounty on his head, Sheriff, dead or alive." The sheriff shot Ellison an irritated glance. "We're here to apprehend a suspect, Mr. Ellison, nothing more." "My worker is here legally," Clara said, raising her voice to address all the men. I hold a valid labor contract, purchased at territorial auction with Sheriff Holcomb himself as witness. Contract be damned, one of the ranchers muttered. You can't tame a rabid wolf. Where are your children, Mrs. Wilkinson? Ellison asked, his tone deceptively gentle. Inside, I presume. Sleeping under the same roof as a killer? Clara's grip tightened on the poker. My children are no concern of yours. On the contrary. Ellison took a step forward, his spurs jingling in the tense silence. The safety of white children in this territory is every man's concern, especially when their mother has taken leave of her senses. That's enough, Ellison, Sheriff Holcomb warned. But the rancher continued, his voice rising. Jacob Wilkinson was a friend to every man here. He fought Apaches. He understood the threat they pose. And now his widow dishonors his memory by harboring the enemy, perhaps even warming her bed with... One more word, Clara interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. And you will not leave this property standing. Ellison's face darkened with fury. You threaten me, a woman alone. He gestured to the men behind him. Look around you, Clara. Accept the inevitable. Where is the Apache? Nchu. As if summoned by the question, Nakohe stepped through the doorway to stand beside Clara. He carried no weapon, having left the shotgun inside, but his presence seemed to fill the night with dangerous potential. The men shifted uneasily, hands moving to pistols and rifles. I am here, he said simply, his deep voice carrying across the yard. Ellison's mouth curved in a cold smile. Stone Wolf. Or do you prefer Nakohe now? Come quietly, and Mrs. Wilkinson and her children won't be harmed. Nakohe regarded the man steadily. You speak of harm while bringing men with guns in darkness. You speak of children's safety while threatening their mother. Though his voice remained calm, Clara sensed the tightly controlled anger beneath his words. What honor is in this? Honor? Ellison's laugh was ugly. Rich words from a savage who raids homesteads and murders innocents. I have killed, Nakohe acknowledged, the admission causing several men to tense further. In war, as have you, but I do not come in night to threaten women and children. Enough talk. Ellison turned to the sheriff. Holcomb, do your duty. Arrest him. The sheriff hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Mrs. Wilkinson, I don't want trouble here. If you just release him to our custody... And then what? Clara demanded. A fair trial, or a rope from the nearest tree as soon as you're out of sight of my property? Now, see here, Holcomb began, but was interrupted by Ellison's impatient gesture. This is pointless. Jenkins, Williams, secure the Apache. The rest of you, check the house for the children. They need to be removed from this situation. Two men dismounted and started forward, rifles raised. Clara stepped in front of Nakohe, the poker held before her. You will not enter my home without a warrant, Sheriff, and you know it. Sheriff Holcomb shifted uncomfortably. Technically, she's right about that, Ellison. To hell with technicalities. Ellison snarled, drawing his pistol. Step aside, Clara. Last chance. What happened next occurred so swiftly that Clara would later struggle to recall the precise sequence of events. As Ellison raised his weapon, Nakohe moved, a blur of controlled violence. In one fluid motion, he pushed Clara behind him and launched something from his hand, a small stone or perhaps a shard of pottery that struck Ellison's wrist with stunning accuracy. The rancher cried out, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the dirt as his fingers spasmed in pain. In the confusion that followed, Nakohe seized the momentary advantage, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her back toward the cabin door. Inside, he commanded, his voice brooking no argument. But it was too late. The other men, reacting to Ellison's cry and the gunshot, surged forward. Two fired their rifles, the shot splintering wood from the doorframe inches from Clara's head. Hold your fire, Sheriff Holcomb shouted. Damn it, there's a woman there! Nakohe pushed Clara through the doorway, shielding her with his body. As they tumbled inside, Clara heard him grunt in pain, felt the warm wetness of blood on her hand where it pressed against his side. "You're hit," she gasped, terror seizing her heart. "A graze," he replied tersely, slamming the door behind them and throwing the bolt. "The shotgun." Clara retrieved it from where he had left it, her hand surprisingly steady despite the pandemonium outside. Men were shouting, boots pounding on the hard-packed earth as they surrounded the cabin. "The children," she whispered, eyes darting to the trapdoor. Had they heard the gunshot? Were they terrified, huddled in the darkness below? "They will stay hidden," Nakoe assured her, checking the wound in his side with an almost clinical detachment. Blood seeped through his shirt, but the injury indeed appeared to be a graze rather than a direct hit. A heavy thud against the door made them both turn. "Mrs. Wilkinson," Sheriff Holcomb called, "this doesn't need to get worse. Send out the Apache and I give you my word he won't be harmed." "Your word?" Clara called back, bitter laughter edging her voice. "While Ellison and his men are ready to shoot through the door." "I'm keeping them in check," Holcomb insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. "But I can't do that forever. The Apache attacked Ellison." "After Ellison drew on an unarmed man and a woman," Clara retorted. "What kind of law are you upholding, Sheriff?" A different voice responded, Ellison's, tight with fury. "The kind that protects civilization from savages and those who harbor them. You have 2 minutes to open this door, Clara, or we burn the cabin down around your ears." Clara's blood ran cold. The cabin was sturdy, but primarily wood. It would catch like tinder if they tried to burn it. "The children," she whispered again, panic rising in her throat. Nakohe's eyes met hers, calm and certain even now. "There is another way." He moved to the fireplace and quickly shifted the large stone at its base, revealing a small compartment Jacob had created to hide valuables. From within it, Nakohe withdrew something Clara had never seen before, a small mirror framed in carved bone. "When the sun rose this morning, I prepared for this possibility," he explained, moving to the window and angling the mirror to catch the light of the men's lanterns outside. "I sent a signal to my people in the hills." "Your people?" Clara stared at him in confusion. "But I thought that I was alone?" A shadow of a smile crossed his face. "An Apache is never truly alone in his own lands." With deliberate precision, Nakohe flashed the mirror 3 times toward the northern hills. Almost immediately, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin, a bird call sounded, too perfect, too deliberate to be natural. "What is that?" one of the men outside called nervously. "Probably just an owl," another replied, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Then another call answered from a different direction, and another, until the night seemed alive with eerie, perfect bird songs, forming a circle around the cabin and the increasingly agitated group of men in the yard. "Apache signals," someone hissed. "We're surrounded." "That's ridiculous," Ellison snapped, but even his voice had lost some of its confidence. "It's just birds, or he's playing tricks." From outside came the distinctive sound of a bowstring's release, followed by a startled cry as an arrow thudded into the ground at Ellison's feet. "Jesus Christ!" one of the men shouted. "They're in the trees!" "Hold your positions!" Ellison commanded, but his authority was crumbling. Another arrow flew, impossibly accurate in the darkness, knocking the lantern from Jenkins' hand and plunging part of the yard into shadow. Inside, Clara stared at Nakohe in astonishment. "How many?" "Perhaps 5, he admitted. "Perhaps none. Apache warriors can sound like 20 when needed." A smile of incredulous hope began to form on Clara's lips, only to die as Ellison's voice rang out, cold with desperate calculation. "Mrs. Wilkinson, I know your children are in there. Send out the Apache now, or I swear to God when we get inside, and we will get inside, they'll wish they died in that fever last winter." Ellison's threat hung in the air like poisoned smoke. Clara's gaze dropped to the rug, concealing the trapdoor, terror seizing her at the thought of Emma and Thomas huddled below, listening to men threatening their lives. "He is bluffing," Nakohe said quietly, reading her thoughts. "He will not harm white children. Even he has lines he will not cross." But doubt shadowed his words. Men like Ellison, cornered and humiliated, were unpredictable. And there were others in that group, drifters with nothing to lose, men hardened by frontier justice and years of bitter conflict. "What do we do?" Clara whispered, the shotgun suddenly heavy in her hands. Nakohe's eyes held hers, steady and certain despite the blood still seeping from his wounded side. "You trust me." Before she could respond, he moved to the window, staying carefully to one side to avoid presenting a target. "Ellison," he called, "I will come out, alone." "No!" Clara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "They'll kill you." Nakohe covered her hand with his own. "Perhaps. Or perhaps there is another way." He gestured toward the mirror, still clutched in his left hand. "My people are watching. They will not let me die without cost." "Your life for my children's safety," Clara said, understanding washing over her like ice water. "That's what you're offering him. It is a good trade." "It's no trade at all." She shook her head fiercely. "There must be another way." From outside, Ellison's voice carried clearly. "1 minute, Mrs. Wilkinson, then we start shooting. And we won't be particular about where our bullets land." Nakohe's expression remained impassive, but his eyes softened as they rested on her face. "There is always another way, but sometimes it requires patience to see it." He pressed the mirror into her hand, closing her fingers around it. "When I step outside, watch the hills. Be ready." Ready for what? But he was already moving toward the door, his steps unhurried despite the urgency of the moment. Clara followed, the shotgun still in her hands, her mind racing to understand his plan, if indeed he had one beyond self-sacrifice. "Wait," she said as his hand reached for the bolt. "At least take the shotgun." Nakohe shook his head. "If I am armed, they have reason to shoot. If I am not..." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Even in the territory, killing an unarmed man, especially in front of a sheriff, would raise questions some might prefer not to answer. "Nakohe." Clara's voice caught on his name. There was so much to say, so little time. He silenced her with a gentle touch to her cheek. "I know," he said simply. Then, with a swift movement that prevented further argument, he unbolted the door and stepped onto the porch, hands raised at his sides to show he carried no weapon. "I am here, Ellison," he called, his voice strong and unwavering in the tense night air. "The woman and children stay inside, unharmed." Clara moved to the window, staying hidden as she watched the scene unfold in the yard. The men had formed a loose semicircle before the cabin, rifles and pistols trained on Nakohe as he stood tall and straight-backed on the porch. Despite his wound, despite the precariousness of his position, he seemed to radiate a quiet power that made even the armed men hesitant to approach. Ellison stepped forward, his pistol aimed at Nakohe's chest. "On your knees, Apache." "I will walk to your horses," Nakohe replied evenly. "I will go with you, but I do not kneel." Ellison's face twisted with malice. "You'll kneel before this night is over. I guarantee it." He gestured with his pistol. "Move, slowly." As Nakohe began to descend the porch steps, Clara angled the mirror as he had shown her, catching the moonlight and directing it toward the northern hills. 3 flashes, then 2, then 3 again, hoping she was signaling correctly, though she had no idea what message she was sending. Outside, the bird calls that had momentarily frightened Ellison's men resumed, closer now. Sheriff Holcomb glanced nervously into the darkness beyond the yard. "Ellison, let's get moving. I don't like this." Not until he's secured, Ellison insisted, producing a length of rope from his saddlebag. Hands behind your back, Apache. Nakohe complied without protest, allowing Ellison to bind his wrists. Clara watched in mounting despair, the shotgun useless in her hands. Whatever plan Nakohe had, it seemed to involve allowing himself to be taken prisoner, or worse. Then, just as Ellison finished tying the knots, a single rider emerged from the darkness at the edge of the property. The men turned as one, weapons raising instinctively, then faltering as they recognized the newcomer. Captain James Blackwood of the U.S. Cavalry sat astride his bay gelding, his uniform dusty but unmistakable in the lantern light. Behind him, more riders appeared, a full patrol of cavalry soldiers, at least 15 strong. "What's going on here, gentlemen?" the captain asked, his cultured Eastern accent incongruous in the rough frontier setting. Sheriff Holcomb stepped forward, clearly relieved at the arrival of official authority higher than his own. "Captain, we're apprehending a wanted Apache, Stonewolf he's called, responsible for raids on my supply wagons near Glorietta Pass," Captain Blackwood finished, surprising the sheriff into silence. "Yes, I'm aware of those incidents." His gaze moved to Nakohe, standing straight despite his bound hands. "Though it seems there might be some question as to who attacked whom in that particular encounter." Ellison's face darkened. "What are you implying, Captain? This Apache is a known killer." "So I've heard." Blackwood dismounted in a smooth motion, handing his reins to a subordinate. "I've also heard other stories recently about an Apache who risked his own safety to bring medicine to fever-stricken white children. About a man who shared agricultural knowledge that might just help settlers survive in this unforgiving land." He glanced toward the cabin, though Clara remained hidden from view. "About a woman brave enough to see beyond years of hatred to recognize a man's true character." Clara's breath caught in her throat. How could he possibly know these things? As if, in answer to her unspoken question, another figure emerged from among the cavalry patrol. An Apache man, older than Nakohe, but bearing a similar enough resemblance that they might be kin. Unlike Nakohe, this man wore a mix of traditional garments and cavalry scout attire, with an interpreter's badge visible on his buckskin shirt. "This is Gray Fox," Captain Blackwood explained to the increasingly confused group of men. "One of our most valued scouts, and I believe a relation of your prisoner there." "Uncle," Nakohe said, a flicker of surprise breaking through his composed expression. Gray Fox nodded once in acknowledgement before addressing the captain in fluent English. "This is the one I told you of, my sister's son. A man of honor, despite what these settlers believe." Ellison's grip tightened on his pistol. "This is absurd. Whatever tales you've heard, Captain, this Apache is dangerous. He has a bounty." "Ah, yes, the bounty." Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, which he handed to Sheriff Holcomb. "By order of the territorial governor, all outstanding bounties on Apache tribesmen are hereby suspended pending review. It seems there have been irregularities in the system, bounties claimed for Apache who were nowhere near the alleged attacks, scalps taken from bodies long dead, that sort of thing." Holcomb read the document, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This appears legitimate." "It is," Blackwood assured him, "as is my authority to take the Apache prisoner into military custody. If he has committed crimes, he will answer for them in a proper military tribunal, not at the end of a vigilante's rope." "This is outrageous," Ellison sputtered, his face flushed with thwarted rage. "Since when does the U.S. Cavalry concern itself with the rights of savages?" "Since we decided that the rule of law applies to all men," Blackwood replied coolly, "even those who might find it inconvenient." His gaze swept over the armed civilians. Now, I suggest you all return to your homes before I'm forced to consider charges of attempted murder and threatening a woman and her children, neither of which, I assure you, would be treated lightly by the territorial court." A tense silence followed, during which Clara could almost see the calculations running through each man's mind, weighing their hatred against the very real threat of legal consequences. Finally, one by one, they began to disperse, mounting their horses and melting away into the night. Only Ellison remained, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "This isn't over," he said to Nakohe, then turned his glare toward the cabin. "For any of you." "Actually, Mr. Ellison, I believe it is," Captain Blackwood countered, "unless you'd like to be the first to test the governor's resolve on this matter." With a final venomous look, Ellison mounted his horse and rode away, leaving only the cavalry patrol, Grey Fox and Nakohe, standing in the yard. Clara hesitated only a moment before setting down the shotgun and stepping onto the porch. Captain Blackwood turned at the sound of her footsteps, offering a polite bow that seemed oddly formal under the circumstances. "Mrs. Wilkinson, I presume. I apologize for the late hour of our arrival." "You're exactly on time, Captain," Clara replied, her eyes moving to Nakohe, still standing with his hands bound. "Though I admit I'm somewhat confused." "I imagine so." Blackwood nodded to one of his men, who moved to release Nakohe from his bonds. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside. Dawn's not far off, and I suspect we could all use some coffee." Within the hour, the cabin that had so recently been under siege became an unlikely gathering place. The children, released from their hiding place, sat wide-eyed at the kitchen table, watching the strange assembly of white soldiers and Apache scouts with undisguised fascination. Emma had pressed herself close to Nakohe's side as soon as she emerged, refusing to leave him even as Clara cleaned and bandaged his wound properly. Captain Blackwood, seated at the head of the table with a cup of Clara's coffee warming his hands, explained how Grey Fox had received word from his kinsman about Nakohe's situation. "We were already in the area, investigating reports of fraudulent bounty claims," the captain said. "When Grey Fox told me about a white woman who had purchased an Apache prisoner and was treating him as an equal, I confess I was skeptical, but the more I heard, the more intrigued I became." "So you came all this way based on a story?" Clara asked, still struggling to believe their good fortune. Blackwood smiled, the expression softening his military bearing. "Mrs. Wilkinson, out here stories are often all we have to guide us, and this one seemed worth investigating." He glanced at Nakohe. "Besides, the governor is genuinely concerned about improving relations with the Apache. The bounties have become an impediment to peace, encouraging the worst sort of men to commit acts that only perpetuate the cycle of violence." "What happens now?" Clara asked, the question directed as much to Nakohe as to the captain. Grey Fox, who had been mostly silent until now, spoke up. "My nephew is free to choose his path. The soldiers will not take him." Clara felt a surge of relief so intense it nearly overwhelmed her. "He can stay here? Legally?" "If that is what he wishes," Captain Blackwood confirmed, "his labor contract with you remains valid, though I suspect its terms might be renegotiated." The knowing look in his eyes suggested he understood there was more between them than a simple business arrangement. All eyes turned to Nakohe, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, his dark gaze moving between Clara and his uncle. "My place is here," he said simply, the words carrying a weight that made Clara's heart expand in her chest. "If I am welcome." "You are," she whispered, not trusting her voice for more. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Captain Blackwood rose to take his leave. Grey Fox would remain behind for a few days, he explained, both to ensure there was no further trouble from Ellison and to reconnect with his nephew after their years apart. The governor is establishing a new policy, Blackwood told Clara as he prepared to mount his horse. Incentives for settlers and Apache to find ways to coexist peacefully. Your ranch could serve as an example, Mrs. Wilkinson. We're just trying to survive, Captain, Clara replied honestly, like everyone else. Perhaps, but sometimes survival requires seeing old enemies with new eyes. He tipped his hat to her. Good day, Mrs. Wilkinson. I suspect we'll meet again. As the patrol rode away, Clara stood on the porch beside Nakohe, watching the golden light of morning spread across the fields they had worked together. The corn was beginning to sprout in the neat mounds he had taught her to create, green shoots reaching toward the sun with stubborn determination. Will it be enough? She asked softly. One captain's intervention? One governor's policy? No, Nakohe admitted. The path ahead is long. Many on both sides will resist change. Then why stay? You could go with your uncle back to your people. Be safe. He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the dawn light. Because here, too, are my people. His gaze moved to Emma and Thomas, visible through the window as they showed Grey Fox their prized possessions with the easy acceptance of childhood. Here is where I choose to build, not destroy. Clara felt the weight of his words, the promise in them that went beyond the moment, beyond even their own lives. 2 pesos, she said, a smile touching her lips despite the tears that threatened. Best bargain I ever made. Nakohe's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the same strength and purpose that had guided them through fieldwork, danger, and the uncertain territory between 2 worlds that had once seemed impossibly divided. The land speaks clearest at dawn, he reminded her, echoing his words from days ago. Listen. And as the morning breeze whispered through the new growth in the fields, carrying the scent of earth and possibility, Clara heard it, not with her ears, but with her heart. The voice of a future being born, nurtured by hands that had once been strangers, but now worked as one. A future paid for with 2 silver pesos and the courage to see beyond boundaries drawn in blood and fear. A future where a widow and an Apache warrior stood side by side, their shadows merging into a single silhouette against the rising sun.